Vikings were the scourge of the medieval world. Across the North Sea, they'd pillage wealth, burn villages, and conquer and found their own nations. They served as guards for the Byzantine Emperor, colonizers to Iceland and Greenland, and were the first Europeans in North America. And they did it all from their heartland in Scandinavia. Or did they? What if Vikings were not just Scandinavian? What if, like all professions, anyone could be a Viking? In particular, the people of the Baltics who, far from being targeted victims or passive observers, were active participants in this early medieval phenomenon. Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. Now, if you don't think this is the case, you would have been right, except that in the last 10 to 20 years, this theory has not only gained traction, but become the prevailing mode of thought. This is where we turn to the town of Salme on the island of Saaremaa, where two of the most impressive Viking ships were uncovered, and what they show us is that not all Vikings were Norse. Back when I covered some of the archaeological sites in the Baltics describing how they entered the historical period, I mentioned the Salme ship burials. Now, there was a lot to talk about on Salme, and the script on the other Baltic areas was already running a bit long, so I decided to do a third video on this. But I do have a note on pronunciation which many of you pointed out in the last couple of videos. Even Googling how to pronounce everything, I still can't get it right. Now, do I feel a little attacked for having an accent and not having a flawless grasp on every language in the world? No, I really don't. It obviously wasn't personal. That being said, I'd rather not attempt the pronunciation this time, and I'll just say Flagelfluben. So with that, let's get on to the video. The most obvious point to make here is who exactly the Vikings were. Historians prefer to use the term Norse to describe the culture and the people from where the Vikings originated, but for this video I'm going to use the term Viking because, unlike the Norse, the Vikings do not belong to a single culture. Vikings in the context of this video are not a cultural group, but rather a specific subset of people who specifically went around exploring, raiding, and pirating, and the term was probably used to describe themselves. The word Viking originates from the term Vikingir, which simply meant pirate. And just as not all crusaders came from the Franks, nor did all Vikings come from Scandinavia. As such, anyone could be a Viking. However, traditional historical narratives treat them as Norse, coming from Scandinavian countries. Don't get me wrong, the term originated in Scandinavia, and the majority of them are still Scandinavian sailing under Norse banners, but their cultural sphere was wider than we tend to think about, which brings us to Estonia. Here, on the island of Saaremaa, lies the town of Salme, and in 2008 this town changed Viking history for good when a huge Viking boat grave was discovered. But what made this unusual wasn't just that it was further east than any other burial of its time, but also that it was older. Indeed, far older than they should have been in this region under the old narratives. Let's zoom out a bit so we can understand the importance of this. Boat graves look something like this, and they're found throughout the Viking world, with most coming from Scandinavia and the British Isles. Boat graves usually contain a single individual, probably someone of elite status, and they have all manner of grave goods and offerings buried with them. They were very common in the Dark Ages, but had fallen out of fashion by the 10th century. The Salme ship burials, then, caused a sensation. The Salme 1 ship, discovered in 2008, at first appeared to be very old and contained no less than 7 males. It was also the first of its kind found in Estonia, or indeed any of the Baltic nations. In this first grave were found game pieces, decapitated hawks, and animal bones from a funerary feast among an assortment of weapons and axes. This was initially radiocarbon dated from between 650 and 780 CE, and while the burial patterns and material culture matched that of Middle Sweden, it was unusual both for the number of individuals and the time period. Scholars barely had a chance to comprehend this find before Salme 2 was discovered in 2010. It was a second ship burial less than 50 meters away. It was not only larger, but also older. Archaeologists worked quickly on both the ships, which were very delicate, but were able to determine the outline of the boats by carefully measuring where they found the nails, rotted wood, and traces of other materials that would make up a ship's hull. And inside were 34 individuals stacked in 4 rows over top of each other, almost all of whom showed signs of battle wounds and were buried with their shields and weapons. None of the individuals in either Salme 1 or Salme 2 seemed to be elite, but in all other respects this was a Viking boat burial. Just one that defied typical Norse convention. Salme II, like Salme I, contained a large number of grave goods, including a massive number of game pieces, birds of prey, and iron and bronze plaques, bear canines, antler combs, and items of whalebone and walrus ivory. Salme II, however, also showed unmistakable signs of battle, and were buried with a massive number of arrowheads, 40 swords, and a handful of spears. But no axes, oddly enough. It is currently believed that both of these ships were dragged to shore by a small handful of survivors who buried their comrades in a mass grave because they lacked the resources to give proper funeral rites to each individual, and thus buried their friends in the sail and covered them with rocks. But it also seems that these boats were buried in different contexts. Dates from the second skeletons yielded similarly early results from roughly 750 CE and earlier. These ships raised significant questions about the Viking sphere in the eastern Baltics. Was this a sign of Viking presence in the east earlier than we thought, or a local custom proving that the people of Finland and the Baltics were just as Viking as the Norse? Well, not necessarily, because right away isotopic analysis began on the skeletons to determine their age and their origin. I've already made a video on how tricky it gets to determine ethnicity from genetics, but isotopic analysis is different. It does not determine ethnicity, but it does determine where an individual grew up using the enamel in their teeth. As your teeth develop, growing up, your enamel will absorb everything in your food and water, leaving traces of oxygen, carbon, and strontium, which together are unique geographic markers. What you consume comes from land with a specific chemical marker, which gets absorbed into your food and water, which then gets absorbed into you. Each geographic location has a unique geologic chemistry and thus marks where you grew up. Carbon can tell you the diet, strontium the geology, and oxygen the water source. Seems simple enough, right? Anyway, what it said about the burials was telling. In Salme I, all individuals were consistent with people from Middle Sweden, specifically the Svea kingdom. In Salme II, all but 7 individuals were from the same region, with 5 coming out of Gotland and 2 from Denmark. In other words, it seems that none of these individuals grew up in the Baltics. Now, isotopic analysis isn't perfect. For one thing, while the chemical balance develops mostly in childhood, it still changes during adulthood. For another, these isotopes are only found in trace amounts, and many regions are similar. Take that, combined with variations in individual body chemistry, the shift in microclimate, class status which would determine your diet, and whether or not you traveled a lot as a child, along with many other individual factors, and it's got a lot of room for error. Nevertheless, isotopic analysis, when done correctly, taking into account all of these factors, is trustworthy. These findings, importantly, were also not taken in isolation. The iron manufacture was sourced from Sweden, all the artifacts were of Swedish or Gotlandic design, and the ritual offerings of birds and dogs are consistent with Swedish burial practices. This would seem to be the nail in the coffin for Baltic origin Vikings. Or is it? See, while Salme may not have been the proof of Vikings originating in the Baltics that some had hoped for, the idea itself is still very much alive. You remember in the last Baltic video I brought up Marika Flegofluben of Tallinn University. Well, her arguments for including the Baltics as part of the Viking sphere are still solid, and she's not the only one arguing them. As usual, I'll put my sources up at the end of this video. Because while none of the Salme skeletons are from the Baltics, isotopic analysis has found Baltic people in Viking graves from elsewhere, Denmark and England in particular. In Denmark, one grave from Trelleborg came from the southern Baltic region, while in England there is a mass grave in Dorset that shows individuals from Courland and as far south as Belarus. There also appears to be a Baltic individual in Repton, Derbyshire, who was part of the Great Army that Alfred the Great defeated. More than this, the Daugava was a major waterway that allowed the Swedes to access Kiev and Rus, and Baltic weapons from the Viking Age look like Swedish and Gotlandic ones, clearly taking inspiration. In addition, not all Baltic graves from this era are linked to Salme. On the Flegofluben Peninsula, also on Saaremaa, as well as in Flegofluben on the Estonian mainland, there are late Bronze Age graves which, in the Baltics and in about the 4th century BCE, that contain goods from Gotland and Sweden, as well as a few others in southwestern Finland and one in Latvia. This proves that trade routes and connections were there for centuries prior to Salme. In addition, these goods coming from Salme are also consistent with graves from the same period in southwestern Finland and Grobinia in Latvia, and Salme II even contains a Finnish sword as well. Salme too is also interesting because despite the fact that many of them were killed in battle, many of them were not actually prepared for it. The presence of a great many game pieces, whalebone and walrus ivory, and prestige symbolic gifts such as a dog and bird of prey have suggested to excavators that this was a diplomatic mission gone wrong. Now, you don't need to know a lot about Viking history to know that these people were fierce warriors, and while they did engage in diplomacy more than pop culture tends to depict, it implies that these people had already known of each other for a long time and fought each other. Finally, while there is a lack of Baltic graves, it's an accident of modern history that we don't know about them. Many site reports remain unpublished or without English translations. Heck, one paper I found was only available in German. Pro tip, if you get your German-speaking girlfriend to translate for you, you can make yourself look well-read and impressive to your viewers without doing any actual work. Which reminds me, like and subscribe or I'll be forced to use AI. Just kidding. Ich mag Witze. Anyway, this German article also showed Soviet-era excavations at the site of Proosa, Flagofluben, my apologies, and these graves from the 5th and 6th centuries contained goods from Scandinavia and eastern Germany too. Grobinia equally appears early in the archaeological record as Seeberg, which used to be on the coast before the river silted up and the coast changed. In other words, contact between the two regions was constant, continuous, and had a lot of cross-contamination. We also know that Western records would not have differentiated between individual Vikings all that much. Take the Varangian Guard, the Viking warriors who guarded the Byzantine Emperor. Byzantine records refer to these as Norsemen or Northmen. However, we know from context that Varangians were just anyone perceived to be a Northern European Germanic warrior from beyond the Holy Roman Empire. Taken together, all this says is that the Viking sphere was wide. This isn't to say that Vikings weren't primarily Norse. Nobody argues that, and we don't want to take away from Scandinavian history and culture. But it does say the Norse cultural sphere and interactions were wider than we previously believed. Even those most generous to the Baltic Vikings will fully admit that this culture came from Sweden, spreading along the coast, only much earlier than traditional narratives believe, and that by the time they had expanded to terrorize Europe, Vikings included those from across the Baltic sphere, which included the Balts, especially the Finns, Estonians, and Curonians. It was a process of Norsification of the Baltics prior to the Viking Age, or a Scandinavianization if you prefer that term. In other words, culture across the Baltic Sea would have been very similar and interconnected. But to return to Salme, these graves are strikingly different from anything in the Baltic or Norse sphere, and as a result, that leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Why these people were buried in a mass grave is a question that we might never know the answer to. What we do know, however, is that someone else from these ships was alive to bury them. Whoever killed the Salme victims obviously didn't kill the whole crew. In fact, some have suggested that this group was already dead based on the way they were stacked and were being transported home. The Swedish king Ingvar's expedition to the Baltics has been floated as an explanation. However, if this was a diplomatic mission, then Ingvar seems less likely. The beach was obviously peaceful, as nobody disturbed the burial processes or robbed the graves later on. So, suggestions of a rushed burial are probably debunked from that logic alone. More likely, the ships were damaged, whether through weather or violence, got to safe ground, and lacked the manpower and resources to do a proper funeral or burial for all of them. But as warriors, they were still afforded a burial of high honors. But who buried them and why, and who these people actually were, will likely remain unknown. What we get then is a picture of a small handful of Viking men, weary from their travels, dragging these boats up onto an abandoned beach, giving their friends and countrymen the best burial they could under the circumstances, little knowing it would trigger a seismic shift in discussions 1,300 years later, forcing us to reconsider exactly who these people were, where they came from, and how they viewed their world. Anyway, that's all I have for today on the Salme shipwrecks and the Baltic Vikings. Please do like the video and subscribe to the channel, and until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.